So this video was made after a friend of mine started arguing with me with the worst possible arguments ever that Napoleon is the best general of all time. Now, is that a terrible take? No, but the arguments were dumb as shit, and I realized that for some people, the cult following of historical leaders and generals is more like professional sports than I first thought. So, with that being said, I'm going to go after a few people who have some of the most over the top fanboys imaginable by bringing a few of these larger than life historical characters down to size. Does this mean that these people sucked as leaders? No. This is just my way of venting and going after the massively overdone fan bases. This list isn't meant to be taken super seriously, so sit back, relax, and listen to some of the best off the top of my head slander that I could think of for these historical figures. Number one, Napoleon. The only people that could have possibly made this list that could be considered more vain are his marshals. To start, let's be honest here. No matter how many times Napoleon fanboys scream about him being normal height, 99% of the world is still going to imagine Napoleon as the fun-sized version of an actual historical general. And while we're talking about size, imagine a world where you're given a conscription base a million times the size of the rest of Europe's armies, then going around and fighting countries who wouldn't arm and train their peasants with a gun to their head, and then screaming nonstop about your military genius as you overwhelm the rest of Europe with more disposable manpower than a 20th century Russian offensive. And how do I know he was screaming about being a military genius? Because every French paper who didn't shout his genius from the rooftops was shut down, while he could handcraft every campaign to make it seem like he is fucking Caesar. While his tactics were good, movement was probably S tier, he still got embarrassed out of Russia and consistently lost to a ragtag group of guerrilla fighters in Spain. He gets smashed by the coalition, sent to Elba, then decides to get riled back up, comes back, gathers his forces, gives all these speeches saying he's emperor again, only for it to last for 5 seconds before he goes to Waterloo and gets smashed by Wellington and some old Prussian drunk guy. He was probably underrated on the level of domestic policy. However, for being the guy who claimed that he was the revolution, a lot of those revolutionary ideals went right out the window when he got power. At least he stopped chopping off heads, though. I also don't know if there is anything that explains the vanity of the Napoleonic French more than one of the best and most well-known marshals being worried about getting his hair messed up as he's about to get shot in the fucking face. His wife was known for banging anything that could walk, and his name is literally synonymous with being a super short dickhead. Number 2, Charles XII of Sweden. As much as I would love to go into the luckiest maneuver ever in Charles X marching an army across literal ice and by the grace of God not being known as the Northern Cold Weather Camp Ices, I have to go with Charles XII. For a kid who wanted to play dress-up soldiers so badly, the guy really wasn't a terrible leader. He led from the front, which is more than you could say for a lot of other historical military leaders, but he's so goddamn uncompromising that his country had to shoot him in the fucking face to get him to stop going to war. While it is true that he ran around the Baltic giving defeat after defeat to every army in the area with all 12 of his men, not consolidating any territory meant that he was basically playing a game where every season he would go out and fight another war for nothing, and one major loss at, say, Poltava was absolute devastation. He was usually outnumbered in battle. This is true. However, the extreme OP nature of his military and the absolute psychos that were his soldiers made sure that he could handle the sheer numbers of less qualified forces. You will absolutely never hear anybody ever argue that Charles XII was good at anything related to running a country besides war, and that's because he basically maxed out his skill tree with things like virtue and left things like domestic policy completely untouched. Maybe he should have looked at a map before invading Russia with all 8 of his men. Was he a good general? It's hard to say since by the time he's done, the army's in shambles, the country's broke, the entire region has coalesced together to fuck Sweden up, and the empire is basically completely gone. So, with results like that, you tell me. Number three, the U.S. is not getting left off this list. George Washington. Considering this guy is considered the absolute god of U.S. leaders, he somehow gets lumped in with other great historical military leaders, and he definitely should not be. He essentially single handedly starts the French and Indian War, which is one of the things that leads directly to the American Revolution in the first place, all because he wanted to dress up and boss people around like an aristocrat. He accidentally starts a major global conflict. England then has to essentially fight a massive war to get out of this situation. Then he leads the American army as it throws a temper tantrum about paying taxes to the country that had just paid and fought in a war that Washington had basically dragged them into. And speaking of the American Revolution, Washington's number one quote unquote asset as a military leader is often cited as his ability to listen to people under his command. Jesus, what a real Alexander the Great. Washington continuously gets his ass kicked up and down the east coast of the continental US, with almost all of his victories being absolute screw ups that he trips into winning because they're so unexpected. And the only reason he ever beats the British is because the French Navy decides to come along and dunk on England for old time's sake. Without the French, even with the best performance by the Continental Army, the English just get on their ships, leave and regroup, and then come back and start kicking Washington's ass again. At least the guy didn't actually want to get into politics, it was more or less forced onto him. Fake humbly accepting the job of leading the army after wearing full fucking military garb for months on end is the biggest joke ever. Second only to the fake story about him cutting down the tree as a kid and not being able to tell a lie. While the guy was a great leader, his prowess as a general is underwhelming, and the fact that he's even on this list is testament to how overstated he is militarily. Number 4, Caesar. I can already hear people screaming at me in the comment section. If you could narrow down why the Romans are thought to have a laughable history of reconnaissance, you would land directly at Caesar. Seriously, if there is anybody who made more of a living walking right into traps and then lucking out and using the overwhelming dominance of his own military forces to get out of those traps, I don't know who it is. The guy can't see 5 minutes ahead for shit in almost every situation, and although he's probably one of the greatest generals ever, he still makes this list, if only because I have to hear from people every 5 seconds how he's one of the greatest generals ever. He conquered some of the most territory, fought some of the most highly thought of generals, the army loved him. Yeah, it almost sounds like this was all written by Caesar himself. Oh yeah, that's because it definitely was. Many, if not most, consider him to be the best Roman ever, except the Senate wanted to try him for breaking the law while he was consul, and even a slap on the wrist wouldn't get him to back down because he couldn't stand the idea that some people might like Pompey more than him. So he decides he's going to throw a fit and start a civil war. Sounds like a real hero. Half of the prominent Romans of the time put a knife into his back during a Senate meeting, and his legacy is one of turning a republic to an empire and having that empire fall into nonstop chaos and civil war after his death, because who would have thought that one person seizing absolute power would end up poorly? Caesar stylized himself as a living legend and the mob loved him for it. But Jesus, the guy was thin-skinned, a tyrant by nature, a writer of his own military history and historical legacy, and an ancient celebrity more than anything else. At least Augustus actually left Rome with something other than constant conflict. Number 5, Frederick the Great. The literal embodiment of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Who would have guessed that someone history refers to as the Great would have been sent off of battlefields to go play with his toys while his actual generals won him battles? Does it count as putting together a great army when you take it over from your daddy and instead of dominating Europe with it, you bleed your manpower and resources dry? I, for the life of me, cannot figure out what is so great about this guy. He fought a war basically to a stalemate with an insanely OP military and S-tier generals, and he constantly blamed them for his failures. And while it is true that organization and discipline can be something for him to hang his hat on, being consistently manhandled by enemies due to being outmaneuvered and winning battles solely based on the OP nature of your army doesn't exactly seem to qualify as a great leader to me. If he didn't have a chance to launch his infantry into the center of an enemy line, he normally lost. And even when he does get his infantry launched at the center of the enemy line, the rest of his army is usually running for their lives while it's happening. If Peter doesn't become Russian Tsar, they probably lose the war in every square inch of gains from it. The absolute best thing I can say about Frederick is for some reason, most other leaders seem to revere him, and that seems to help him more than anything else actually does. At least Alexander took over a massive empire with the OP army he inherited, and he didn't lose half the battles of his major war. And a bonus round, just because it was put to me that this guy was so great that it would be impossible to roast him, Gustavus Adolphus. Does stealing military ideas from the Dutch and implementing them in your army count as giving the army new ideas and techniques? Imagine spending your whole fucking life running around Europe fighting for some theoretical future of Protestantism, only for your own daughter to convert to Catholicism. Maybe if Gustav would have spent a little more time on the home front instead of running around Europe trying to fight anything that moved, he wouldn't have a successor who immediately turned against the entire movement he was supposedly fighting for. While there is little doubt Gustav fought good generals throughout Europe, outmaneuvering them in many circumstances, he gets brought into essentially what looks to be a trap at Lutzen, and the only reason the Swedes got to claim victory there is because of the brutal decision of the Imperial Army to retreat, after just handing out double the casualties to the Swedish army and fatally wounding the Swedish king in the process. The biggest issue I have with Gustav is all of the propaganda about how great of a leader he was, how he was the hero of Protestantism, fought all of his battles with less men, although a ton of sources think the Swedes outnumbered enemy forces in a ton of battles, and how he quote-unquote broke the Imperial Army. In reality, Gustav's lack of diplomacy meant if he lived, this war would probably go on forever, and he did at least as much to hurt the Protestant cause as help them because of this. Without all the propos, I'd say he's even with, or even a little worse than, Wallenstein. And now it's time for a speed round. Alexander the Great. He railroaded through the region's superpower while completely blitzed out of his mind, that he was paranoid as shit before the end, and drank himself to death before we could figure out whether he could actually competently lead a country. Genghis Khan. Absolutely obliterated almost everything he touched, but he gets total credit for the military achievements of Subutai, and couldn't conquer China before his death. For some reason, he's talked about today as if he was an absolute gentleman who brought trade and prosperity to a world he mostly massacred. The Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. Tactically, he was an absolute monster, but his subpar logistical understanding is for some reason mostly blamed on Germany as a whole. He tried to supply an offensive over about 8 billion miles of desert, and was hyped up after the war so the face of Germany didn't have to solely be an extreme anti-Semitic who looked like he'd been on a month-long coke bender. Hannibal. Crossed the Alps and bitch-slapped Rome multiple times, all just to stare over the horizon at the city of Rome itself. For someone who supposedly hated Rome his whole life, he sure seemed to want just to retire and hang out in the Italian countryside. As brilliant as he was, the Romans could literally beat him by just playing hide-and-go-seek with their armies and never fighting. MacArthur and Patton. This one is one I actually somewhat believe. Both took and got credit for almost anything done by the Allies during the war, and were, by most accounts, absolute dicks. Patton slapped a soldier with PTSD, and MacArthur made sure his planes were neatly lined up in the Philippines for a Japanese bombing run. Both had good moments of the war for sure, but not nearly as many as you would think with their reputation, and both led and participated in marching and fighting against their own fucking men who were starving to death in the bonus army. It cost Hoover his re-election, but it's way too overlooked for both of these commanders. And lastly, Franz Halder, an actual piece of shit compulsive liar who was better at train schedules than doing anything else on the battlefield. He was more confident in a win for Barbarossa than even Adolf was, yet somehow everyone believed him post war when he told him he warned him against it. He can't see the big picture for shit and should have been shot in the face for insubordination during the push into the USSR. So that is the end of my ranting for this one. Every general that I could think of off the top of my head that I have some sort of issue with, something that someone in their fan base has said at some point in time, is on this list. If you are not upset by this point and you love one of the generals on here, I did not do my job well enough. Let me know if I left anybody off the list that you would add, and I'll see you all next time.